right off. Okay, so did everybody get it? Is everybody getting a note?
Yes.
Yep, got it. This is Catherine.
Okay, excellent. So for this talk, after the first 5 or 6 introductory slides, it can get technical. I've just realized that there's at least 3 people on the call, maybe 4, who haven't had the basic fundamentals of psychophysiology course, which means you may run into something that's a little more technical than you're used to. Do not be shy about asking questions, or else this whole thing is ridiculous. Is that okay? So is that a deal? Just interrupt.
Okay.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is the psychophysiology underlying the perception of ghosts and similar apparitions. Nothing that you hear in this talk precludes the possible existence of signals, beings, and other phenomena which science has yet to explain nor demonstrate the existence of. So this is not a talk that knocks the possibility of there being ghosts and everything else, okay? Ghosts are paranormal events. Paranormal events are purported phenomena described in popular culture, folk, and other non-scientific bodies of knowledge whose existence within these contexts is described as beyond normal experience or scientific explanation. And that's from Wikipedia, which I don't normally quote from, but that's what the main part of the world in science thinks. The key here, when you talk about paranormal, is they mean not scientifically explainable. And the word you hear all the time is supernatural. Supernatural merely means beyond natural, as beyond our current understanding. As our understanding of our senses and processing keeps changing, the definition of supernatural is a constantly moving target. And since most of the people who write in this area are psychologists and philosophers and bunches like that who've never taken a biology course, it's very, very odd what they come up with, because they don't know anything about how our senses work. You know, that somebody taught them about senses while they were in elementary school, and they haven't learned anything since. So I'm not knocking psychologists per se. It's just that so many of the people who do writing in this area simply have no background in physiology, so they say odd things. And of course, physiologists who know nothing about psychology say a lot of odd things too. So, and physiology types rarely talk about ghosts very seriously. So what's a ghost? The general definition of a ghost is an apparition of a dead person which is believed to appear or become manifest to the living, typically as a nebulous image. Please remember nebulous image, okay? You'll hear a huge amount more about that as this talk goes on. Here's another quote. In folklore, a ghost is the soul or spirit of a dead person or animal that can appear to the living. Remember animal. In ghost lore, descriptions of ghosts vary widely from an invisible presence, remember invisible, to translucent or barely visible wispy shapes, to realistic lifelike forms. Each one of those, as you're going to learn in this talk, has a different psychophysiological basis. In other words, it's just like diseases that have a similar name or a similar set of criteria of symptoms, but have different causes. This is the same situation. Other terms associated with it are apparition, haunt, phantom, poltergeist, shade, specter, spirit, spook, and wraith. And I'm not going to cover any of those particularly. We're going to stick closer to ghost-like things. But these are related. It's just that the research on these is not as good. Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
So what I'm saying is basically keep nebulous in mind and keep the idea that different descriptions may have different causes. When we talk about paranormal experiences or supernatural, for some reason, scientists and the public feel that these are still very rare. In fact, if you do an anonymous survey of thousands upon thousands of people, it turns out that most people have what are called paranormal experiences. You know, for instance, leaving your body and thinking you're floating around above your body, things like that. The vast majority of the population has had that experience, especially when they're young children. So this is not abnormal because the majority of people have this. Does that make sense? So when we talk about paranormal experiences, we're not talking about something rare. We're talking about the majority. However, having a paranormal experience, which involves a ghost or ghost-like situation, does not equal evidence that a ghost actually appeared to you. You know, that a dead person, animal, or whatnot appeared to you. There's a difference between an experience and a reality. Rather, they're indicative of something, but we don't necessarily know what. We just want to keep an open mind. So let's apply a bit of logic. There are far too many specific reports of repeated phenomena which are not explained by current science to be dismissed. For example, phenomena which occur in the same place among people who are not expecting the phenomena, like people visiting an old basement, you know, the same old basement, say in a youth hostel where they have no idea that the basement tends to have very unusual sensations associated with it, and they all experience the same thing. Another example is individuals who experience friendly phenomena who are really, really helpful. An example of this is almost every major creative scientist and artist reports getting information that they needed to solve problems. And very often it occurs as a voice coming from someplace. And these people aren't any more nuts than anybody else. But this is original information that they didn't have, that they needed. And it came from someplace, they just don't know where. Now we have a pretty good idea of how it works thanks to our being able to do EEG recordings of the left and the right brain. We know that the right brain knows a lot of things the left conscious brain doesn't. So we know a lot more now than we used to. Anyway, so next part of logic is that our knowledge of how our senses work which senses we have and what we can sense is changing very, very rapidly. Reaching a decision that supernatural phenomenon cannot occur because they cannot be accounted for through our current understanding of science is simply not rational because we've got a moving target. Our current understanding of science keeps moving. So far this making sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the central assertion of this talk is that the old saying, seeing is believing, is absolutely incorrect. In fact, you cannot trust any of your senses, your interpretation of what you sense, nor your memories of what you sensed. Evidence supporting each of these assertions has been gathering strength over many decades and is now sufficiently strong that we can say with no reasonable doubt that what we consciously experience frequently has little to do with reality, with what actually happened. And that's something that's incredibly difficult for us to accept. Let me give you an example that everybody finds difficult to deal with, but that we've known about for many, many decades. What you're hearing right now, what I'm saying, other than any delay due to Zoom and electronics, there's a delay in the time between something that I'm saying is reaching your senses and reaching your consciousness. You're a tenth of a second behind me. And if it's a complex idea that I'm presenting that you're not familiar with, you may be 2 or 3 tenths of a second behind. So you're living in the past. That's why we need reflexes to stay alive. So again, what's going on is not necessarily what you think is going on or even when it's happening. So during this talk, I'm going to concentrate on how our senses mislead us in a myriad of ways into thinking that we've had supernatural experiences, as the senses we commonly discuss don't function the way we think they do. And we have many more senses than are commonly recognized. Once again, this does not imply that supernatural experiences independent of our senses don't occur. So, key elements of the talk. 1, our senses are very limited, so there are objects all around us we don't perceive. 2nd, our senses don't work the way we think they do. In fact, virtually all of our senses are only designed to pick up motion, to detect motions and patterns. They don't produce a nice, pretty picture or sound picture of what's going on around us. That's an illusion that's built up inside our brains. We frequently are not aware of information our senses are sending to us. Our senses pick up signals they weren't designed to sense. Different individuals and different species are differently sensitive to frequencies both within and beyond the normal range. In other words, you and the person next to you or on this call aren't picking up the same limited number of frequencies. You're all different. You go into different ranges. And as you age, the range of frequencies that you can detect decreases radically. So little kids usually have a far, far wider range of frequencies they can detect than adults. The physical functioning of our senses changes with emotions, which is hard to realize. So I'm not talking about an interpretation of what the senses are sending in. I'm talking about the senses actually changing. What we consciously perceive is different from the signals sent to our brains because they're altered by memory, experience, expectation, and emotion. And lastly, things really do go bump in the night that we absolutely have no explanation for. So that's what I'm covering. Okay? Just making sure everybody's still there. I don't want to find out my internet went dead and
We're still here.
out there.
Yeah, we're
Okay.
doing well. Mhm.
Excellent. Okay. So perception. Perception's a dynamic process which can be partially conscious or unconscious, which tends to come near the end of a series of inconsistent steps. And they really are inconsistent. You can't tell which steps are being skipped or going through when you're sensing something. It begins with sensation of the internal and external environments, continuing through lots of processing steps in the peripheral and central nervous systems, finally ending up with a gestalt of what we consciously think is happening. And when I say the internal environment, I mean what your nerves are doing, how they're working, how your hormones are working, what's going on in your memory, in your how your right brain is accessing memories, things like that. Of key importance, perception's influenced by the way your senses happen to be working at that moment of time, your prior experiences, expectations, memories, competing inputs, and changes in how the signal is processed by the CNS and PNS. So the exact same input, you know, what's going on around you, like a tree that you happen to be standing in front of, the same input can be very different perceptions for different people and the same person at different times. So if you're standing in front of a tree, you know, you might be smelling the tree, you might be feeling temperature from the tree, you might be perceiving the texture of the tree, the solidity, et cetera, et cetera. But different people are having a different perception of that tree, and your perception of the tree is different at different times. So sensation plus processing equals perception. Okay, so first topic, our senses are very limited. So there are objects all around us we don't perceive. So if any of you miss what I'm saying in this slide, please have me go over it, okay? With the possible, and I add possible exception, of senses designed to pick up taste, smell, and gravity. All of our known senses are designed to pick up electromagnetic vibrations coming in at a limited portion of the spectrum of wavelengths. Even heat and sound are vibrations. And it now turns out that taste, smell, and gravity actually are vibrations that we're picking up. This is just being proven now. So if you look at that figure on the top left, frequency is measured by how many waves pass a point every second. So you see where can you all see this slide, or should I make it bigger?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so wavelength is the idea of the same point on a wave going by you. And some wavelengths are the diameter of our planet, others are teeny. So a wavelength is from one part of a wave to another. That's the same part. So it doesn't matter if it's peak to peak, trough to trough, or whatever. There are wavelengths across the spectrum that we're normally exposed to. So very, very slow waves, like radio waves. Some radio waves, again, are the diameter of our planet. Microwaves come a little quicker, infrared a little quicker. Here's visible light. Look at ultraviolet, it's getting quicker. X-rays are very quick. Gamma rays are very, very quick. The thing is that visible light is a teeny, teeny little part of the spectrum. So here's the part of the spectrum of wavelengths we can perceive. Longer wavelengths like the reds, shorter wavelengths like greens and blues, going out to purples, ultraviolet. Do you see what I'm showing there?
Yeah, we can see.
So different animals can sense different wavelengths. Elephants are better than we are, as are whales, at infrasound. Children have a much wider range of sounds they can hear and see than we do, than adults do. But there's just basically a range of sound. Creatures like bats can hear in a much higher frequency than we can, but they can also hear in most of our frequency range. Making sense so far?
Yeah.
So our ability to sense our environment is limited by our senses, anatomy, and physiology, and how the senses work with our brains. So what we can perceive in the first place is limited by the physical constraints of our senses. Like you can't see far into the ultraviolet and infrared frequencies on either side of those frequencies we can see. So objects can be there we don't know about, as in when it's dark. When we look up in the stars at night, we only see those stars which shine in wavelengths our eyes can pick up. So remember, children see more stars than we do, but not that many. But humans see only a tiny minority of the stars. In fact, space is absolutely full of objects. They're just not sending light at frequencies we see. Those big blank areas between the stars aren't big blank areas. There's very few empty spaces. Our senses frequently fool us because they work with the brain's wiring to add items which aren't there or transform an object into a different one. For example, when you walk into a room, which you've been in many times recently, your eyes skip looking at large blank areas of the walls, and your memory fills in what's usually there. The trouble is, it may not be there. You're seeing things that aren't actually on that wall. Just your memory says they're on the wall, but they look absolutely real to you. While this does save processing time, the value of the strategy is balanced out by your missing changes, such as a new hairstyle, a small picture in a previously blank area, etc. Now, schizophrenics don't have this problem as much as we do, because when they look at a wall that they've seen a million times, they actually look at the wall as something new. Their memories don't fill in the details as much. So what we consciously think we're perceiving has already been processed at a minimum of 2 levels before we become aware of it. Your sensory homunculus filters for detail, and your memory and expectation areas fill in the missing parts and decide what we're sensing. This is absolutely crucial because we are not wired to see an object accurately if we have no experience with it. And I'm going to repeat this example many times. People who've never seen an airplane before tend not to notice the engines and draw the wings as being bird wing shaped. These studies were done during World War I in Africa when planes started flying over people. And then in World War II, in parts of South America and Africa where people never saw airplanes, but airplanes were dropping supplies to people who were cut off. So airplane cults developed where these magic birds were dropping all kinds of magic supplies. And there are movies about that, like The Gods Must Be Crazy. So I mentioned that objects that are not reflecting wavelengths we can sense may not be able to be detected. I talked about the stars. Many animals, such as dogs, can see in wavelengths further on either side of the visible spectrum than we can. Thus, a dog may see a deer at night, even upwind, when we think there's nothing present. This is separate from their sense of smell. So there are numerous objects that surround us all the time that we can't sense. For instance, we actually cannot sense still, clean air. So there's 14 pounds per square inch at sea level of air pressing down against you right now, right this second. If you're at sea level, how many of you can feel that 14 pounds of air? Anybody?
No.
No, nobody. None of you can. We can't. Can you see clean, still air? No. Can you feel it? No. As long as the thing stays still and is clean, even though it's 14 pounds per square inch squeezing on you, you simply cannot sense it. Many gases, dust, electromagnetic systems, and etc., that are dissolved in floating of air or floating in air, we cannot sense at all. Zero, zip. There are many tiny animals and plants that we simply cannot sense. They're too small or moving too fast, or they're not dense enough for our senses to pick up. You know about no-see-ums, tiny, tiny little bugs that are there, but they're so widely scattered and so tiny that until they move, you can't sense them. The very tiny pollen grains in the air that are too small for you to see until they get dense enough, until there's a whole lot of pollen in the air. The big deal is low density objects. Air is low density. All these other things that I'm talking about are very low density. For our senses to work, objects have to be sufficiently dense for us to perceive them. So let's take a small cloud. A small cloud of water vapor or a small electromagnetic cloud. You walk through them all the time without knowing you've done so. The key here is that many of these clouds you walk through have sufficiently complex electromagnetic circulations with a sufficient variety of substances in them that you may not be able to sense them, but they react to you and change what they're doing based on you and what you're doing. In other words, we can't sense them, but they can sense you. For example, ball lightning clouds that are that haven't become dense enough to perceive, they respond to people all the time. So ball lightning was only actually proved to exist about 45 years ago. You know, everybody knew that ball lightning was around, but there wasn't the actual proof until Aberdeen Proving Ground got sick and tired of these things screwing around with their studies and went and caught some. And it turns out they're highly responsive to people. That doesn't mean they're conscious, but they change what they're doing, which alters our perception, because when they change enough to reach our senses, then we can sense them. What's really funny is what they do is they can cut the transmission, the electronics of a car off. So the cars tend to die when these things are around, when they get dense enough. Anyway, going on with that. Oh, I'll give you another example that's kind of funny. Everybody knows about tornadoes. You know, these are big, deadly things that have caused a problem. Kelly, I realize you've raised your hand. I finally caught on to that. Hang on a second. I'm going back to the previous slide. You know, tornadoes are an absolute nightmare, but there are teeny, teeny, tiny tornadoes that are anywhere from a foot high to, well, I should, say a third of a meter high, up to maybe 15 or 20 meters high, that we used to think were simply small tornadoes. But it turns out there are several types of them. And several of them are so sensitive electromagnetically to what's going on, that a great example is that when one of these little tornadoes happens to come onto a soccer field, they'll get involved with the game. And all of a sudden, there's this little tornado pushing the goalposts around. Or it'll follow a bunch of kids over to a playground. That happened to my children. When my wife and I were watching, all of a sudden this little tiny whirlwind was playing with the swing set that our kids were on, and it bent the seesaw, and then it moved off elsewhere. But these things are very, very interactive. Okay, so we had a question.
Oh, I just, I guess I don't really know what the ball lightning is. I was never really heard of it before. And the way you're talking about it interacting I was curious about them.
Okay, when I say interacting, I do not mean that it's conscious, that it's an organism.
Okay.
Things change depending on our electronics, on water vapor in the air, things like that. Ball lightning is a misnomer because it looks a little like a ball of vapor, like a little cloud. And you can see, when you're looking at it, electromagnetic flashes that look like lightning in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I've
But
never
it's
seen
not a
one.
lightning bolt.
Are they common?
Yes.
Where would I see one?
In places that are near swamps.
Oh, I live in a swamp.
Then you should be seeing them all the time.
I don't. Maybe I'm just not looking out for them. I'll have to
They're around, well, they're almost impossible to see during the day.
Right.
You would see them at night.
Okay.
You would see them as a flicker.
A flicker.
Yeah, moving along. And then when you shine a light on them, you realize that there's a ball of vapor there. And when you use your flashlight, very often the flashlight goes dead as you get close to them.
Oh.
What swamp do you live in?
Well, I live on Sanibel Island, so we're always underwater, and we have mangrove trees in my front yard, and all around me is water. There's lots of canals, and
You
it's
should
very, very
see,
wet.
you live in the right climate to see them. The first time I saw them was at Aberdeen Proving Ground, which is the same kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And salt water helps a lot. So you live in a saltwater environment. So we
Oh,
can talk about this separately. Look up ball lightning on Google. And then
okay.
let's talk about this separately.
Okay.
Or if the whole group wants to talk about ball lightning more, we can at another time.
Okay. Thank
I
you.
just don't want to run out of time here.
Yeah.
So remember, this talk's going to be a little more than an hour. And remember, we got started 10 minutes late because of another class being here. So the next thing is that there are small, high-speed objects that are too fast and small for us to sense, like neutrinos. Millions of cosmic rays are hitting us every second. They're hitting you right now. Most go right through us, but others hit and damage our cells, especially our DNA. It's this bombardment of our DNA with cosmic particles, which turns out to be virtually the entire cause of the background rate of DNA mutations. We've now discovered what causes mutations. The background rate, that's what it is it's cosmic particles. What's been discovered within the last 10 years is that these cosmic rays hit our nerves and change them. They change their functioning and thus our behavior. They change the DNA in the nerves, but also vital part of the nerve functioning. So this is new. And again, we can't sense these things. So in sum, there's no reason a very real object with very low density and not reflecting light and other vibrations we can sense cannot be next to you right now without your having any ability to perceive it in any way. That's simply our wiring. And there's also no reason that such an object cannot be sentient. Many objects that we have discovered are very close to sentient, like ball lightning, but they're not. But that doesn't mean there aren't ones that are. And this little illustration is a blob that's walking along with a kid. That's just from the children's book series, The Boy and His Blob. So we have black-tailed deer in our sparsely populated, heavily wooded neighborhood. Nearly all the deer born in the neighborhood remain there for their entire lives because black-tailed deer have a tiny little range. So these deer know all the people, dogs, and etc., even if we don't see them every day. I love to walk in the woods at night. When I walk in the woods, I cannot see or otherwise sense most of the animals surrounding me, even though some, such as deer, are quite large. And there's a cougar that lives here. There's a couple of bear. I never can sense any of these things. I used to be terrified when we first moved here about 20 years ago of the cougar that hangs around and looks at us at night. But it turns out it was a buddy of my wife's, where they had become friendly and it wasn't being dangerous at all. It was just standing there. Anyway, even with a powerful headlamp, it's easy to miss the deer if they close their eyes and look away. Thus, sentient beings are next to me, but I can't sense them at all. I can't smell them. I can't see them. I don't feel the heat coming from them. I don't hear the noises they make. And this is getting to be a little bit of a pain this season because there's a little deer that sleeps along our driveway. And as I was making up this slide set, the little guy was right there, a couple of meters away from me, but it was laying down along the driveway. And all of a sudden, these two little eyes are right on the ground. And I thought it was a cougar or something, but it was just the fawn laying down, laying there. But I couldn't see it. I shined my very powerful headlamp on it, and it was so well blended in with the leaves and whatnot that I still couldn't see it. I finally walked up to it and was finally able to see it. So don't ever think that there aren't things there that you don't know about. Okay, our senses don't work the way we think they do. Again, as I said, our senses are pattern and motion detectors. They're not picture builders. The pictures are built in our brains, and they have very little to do with what's out there, because all you're picking up is patterns and motion, not the object. So it's our imaginations that make the picture of what's there. Do you hear what I'm saying? It's not what the senses are sending.
Yeah. A quick question. So when we are looking at art, like that is not, that is not kinetic art, like paintings and things, we're still projecting a lot, and
Yes.
every person sees it differently.
Yeah, you don't see that art. You're not seeing what's actually there. The painter painting it probably hasn't seen much of it. And we're going to get to a concrete example of that in a few minutes. If you look at abstract art that has a lot of sharp edges, you're seeing that a lot more accurately than you're seeing pictures of a bowl of fruit, where people are trying to draw a lot about the texture of the fruit. What you're really seeing is the edges of the fruit, and the texture is being added by your memory and your imagination from when you touched it and ate it and whatnot. Anyway, so our senses react best to motion crossing an edge in a matrix of detectors. If the object doesn't cross an edge or doesn't change in some other way, our senses may not detect it at all. We need to detect motion to avoid being eaten. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm picking up a lot of background noise. Our senses have evolved this way because we need to detect motion to avoid being eaten. Our senses are also designed to pick up patterns. If there's no real pattern, our senses will work with our brains to invent one. This is crucial. That's why we frequently think we hear a voice or words when there's just random noise, or we think we're seeing something which is just a random collection of unrelated objects, like mistaking a bunch of leaves for a chipmunk. We're built to make a pattern out of something that's not a pattern. We're frequently not aware of information our senses are sending to us. And I only made the one slide on this because it's a whole chunk of a course. We detect pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that are sent out by other organisms that we pick up, especially other humans. They influence our emotions tremendously, especially fear and attraction, friendship and sexual attraction. But we can't sense that pheromones are coming in. We have no ability to consciously sense it. Yet every study that's been done within the last about 15 to 20 years shows that the way that we're attracted to people is because of pheromones, not all the other stuff. We also cannot consciously detect magnetic fields around us. Yet these cause our hairs to stand on end and give us the willies, etc. So we have very, very good senses for electromagnetic fields, but we are not consciously aware of it, yet they affect us. The next big deal is that our senses pick up signals they weren't designed to sense. By the way, before I get away from the pheromone thing, does everybody get an idea of what I'm talking about?
Yes, my question is what you mentioned that this was an entire course. What is the name of this course, and can we take it? Has
Yes.
it been created yet?
Oh yeah, I give it every other summer or so. It's hormones and perception.
Okay.
And also we cover pheromones a little bit in the foundations course, Fundamentals of Psychophysiology.
Yeah.
We cover the senses a little bit.
Yeah, this is made to be like some sort of like mystical, spooky type of thing, and so I'm just wondering why why it's just made to be so kind of ooh, when it doesn't need to be. You know what I mean?
I mean pheromones and electromagnetic ability to feel magnetic fields and whatnot.
To sense things, exactly.
Oh yeah, well the senses, remember, it's mostly people that have never had a biology course that write about this stuff.
Right.
It's very embarrassing. So let's see. So, Jesus, this is 50 years ago. Oh Lord. So 55 years ago, when I was a graduate student at the American Museum of Natural History, they actually had graduate schools back then, okay? So I was a graduate student, and we had electricity and all that, okay? No jokes about it. I was there when they discovered that birds could detect magnetic fields. They closed down the big domes for detecting for showing star shows at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and they set a bunch of birds loose in there and showed them stars, and found out that these things are useless at navigating by the stars. But as soon as they stuck magnets up on the roof, the birds navigated with the magnets. And then people in my department at the museum took apart the bird's brain and found the magnet sensing cells. So that's going back 55 years. And then another group found them in mammals, in rodents first. And then another group, much more recently, has found them in humans. We can detect magnetic fields. We have you know that we have iron scattered throughout our body. Our blood wouldn't work without iron. Well, in our brains, we have little collections of iron that's magnetized, so we can pick up magnetic fields. There are a few cells in our sensory cortex that are very, very good at this. Okay, somebody started to talk. Tony?
No, that was me, Tanya. I was just
Okay.
that was okay. You answered it.
You
answered the question.
Pheromones. People knew about pheromones in insects. The guy that discovered pheromones in insects had the lab across from mine. This is now going back 60 years ago. He was working with migrating ants. And he had these ants that were living on one side of his desk blotter. And the food supply was on another. And he was watching them go back and forth. And he spilled coffee on his blotter. So he turned the blotter over, not thinking it would have any effect on the ants. And all of a sudden the ants couldn't find the way around. Well, since the blotter was, just a piece of absorbent material, he cut out the area where the ant trails were, and he found out it was chemical. He discovered pheromones. And then a couple of years later, while I was in the Army, we discovered pheromones in hamsters. So, these things are very, very real. I just happened to be involved with the discovery of them. So believe me, this is not woo-woo. Okay, so, it's just a matter of who reads the scientific literature in biology.
Right.
Okay, so our senses fool us by picking up types of input they aren't designed for. And this has nothing to do with illusions. Your eye is a sack of fluid. If you close your eyelids and then press very gently on your eyes, but firmly for 30 seconds or so, you begin to see odd shapes and colors, but especially odd shapes way out at the edge of your periphery. What you've done is stimulate the eye's sensors, the rods and cones, but mostly the cones, way out, the rods, way out on the periphery, by using pressure instead of light energy. Your mind can only interpret the information coming from the rods and cones as light, even though what they're perceiving is pressure. Just like any fluid-filled container, the eye resonates with different frequencies of waves hitting it, depending on the shape and elasticity of the container, viscosity and density of the liquid, and etc. Exactly the same situation as hearing. A child's eyes and ears, the fluid in there has a different density and viscosity than an adult's. So they sense things differently, frequencies coming in differently. When a vibration comes into your eyes at about 17 to 18 hertz, they pick it up. The fluid vibrates, and your eye, especially your rods way out on the periphery, think that they're detecting hazy light. Okay, that's 17 to 18 hertz. And if you have any kind of a signal generator at home, just do this, and you'll get a hazy image in the periphery. The waves don't have to be powerful, so you can't feel them against your skin. And they're too low frequency, even for their harmonics, to set off hearing. The waves stimulate the rods at the very edge of your retina. As the rods only transmit gray tones, what you perceive are dim, gray, amorphous shapes floating at the edge of your visual field. This only works in the very dim or dark because the regular stimulation of the rods from light overwhelms this effect. These slow waves are reinforced in heavily walled areas with lots of turns. Yep, this accounts for many reports of ghosts in old basements and whatnot. These frequencies are produced by outlets that are not properly grounded, by regular frequencies in the air that are reinforced by solid stone walls, especially in humid areas. That's where ghosts come from that you're perceiving in an old basement. And we can duplicate that very easily. The same thing happens with those those frequencies for the ear. The stirrup in your ear vibrates, but the vibration is so slow that it doesn't set off the nerves for hearing. What it does do is set off the fight, flight, freeze response. So you get really scared when these waves come in while you're in a dim area with nebulous images in your periphery. That's why you get the willies when you're in this kind of environment. And that's it. That's what's happening. And again, we duplicate this very easily in the lab. Many children have the equivalent of temporal lobe epilepsies as their brains mature, and especially thin connections between different parts of their ears. So they're far more likely to experience ghosts than adults. So that's one of the very, very common things that's happening. And we'll get to more of other possibilities in just a moment. And I realize that we're up to an hour. Different individuals and species are differently sensitive to frequencies, both within and beyond the normal range. That's why any two people rarely agree on just what they sense. Individually different sensory capabilities, which leads to endless arguments. And you've all experienced this kind of thing. Like heterosexual men see far fewer colors than women. We just don't see them. That's why there are signs in paint stores that husbands have to have a note from their wives before selecting colors. Men are not seeing what women are seeing. It's not that we don't care. It's our eyes don't work the same way. And that's, you know, sexist, but real. So there's endless arguments about that, but that's true for, you know, seeing into different frequencies. Okay, the functioning of our senses change with emotion. When we're stressed, peripheral vision decreases. So we don't notice people and objects that are right next to us, but over to the side. We just don't see them. It's, we're focused on what's straight ahead, what's ever scaring us. Slow movements when we're under stress are not easily detected, nor are stationary objects. So you can miss somebody nearly in front of you or moving slowly. Because under stress, we're looking for things that are moving quickly and getting ready to attack. We're just plain wired that way. Low tones are not processed as well. We're looking for staccato changes. So somebody speaking with a deep voice won't be heard. You just don't hear it. It never gets into the brain. This is wiring. What we consciously perceive is different from the signals sent to our brains because they're altered by memory, experience, expectation, and emotion. Now, this is a very, very big deal because we all grew up in cultures where paranormal experiences are part of our folklore. We're all expecting paranormal experiences when we sense something unusual. We're primed to interpret unusual perceptions as being related to ghosts and etc. And we can discuss priming a great deal at other times, but priming is a huge part of how our sensations work. It's what we're expecting. And you don't know that you've been primed. There's nothing conscious. It's just that as sensations go through parts of your cortex and your amygdala, they add what they think should be there, even though they're not. It's wiring. For normal vision, if you live in a forest, really a jungle, if you live in a jungle, there aren't really straight lines in nature. When you start seeing straight lines for the first time, it's very, very difficult for people who grew up in that kind of environment to really see a ruler straight line. If you've never seen an airplane, as I said, you don't really see the airplane. You see some kind of a weird bird. And we've already talked about the paint problem. Okay, so again, your conscious mind does not have a direct window to the outside world. Your conscious mind doesn't know whether the signals it's working with, that you consciously perceive, began outside your body, along the nerves connecting sensors to the brain, or in some part of your brain. And this is crucial. That last part is crucial. But just the problem with your not knowing where a sensation starts, remember that if you have a nerve, there's some kind of noise in the background. Okay. Think of what happens when there's a nerve that's supposed to pick up sensations from a finger and it's pinched at the elbow. When you hit your elbow, you feel tingling along your forearm and into your fingers. Everybody's had that happen, right? You hit your funny bone.
Yes.
Okay. There is no way that you can convince your conscious mind that you're not feeling tingling along your forearm and in your fingers. But you're not. There's nothing happening in your forearm or your fingers. Your nerves are fooling you, and they do this all the time. Your brain fools you all the time because it brings in memories in order to interpret those patterns that your sensors are sending to you. Remember, they don't send a picture. They send patterns. You have to build that pattern. So the conscious part of your brain is in the prefrontal neocortex. But that thing is not connected directly to anything at all. The information has to go through all kinds of other parts of your brain. It has to go through especially parts from memory, which put the signal in context with similar signals. That's why a bunch of leaves look like a chipmunk. It goes through the amygdala, where if you got bitten by a chipmunk, all of a sudden you have a negative emotional reaction. That's not part of the consciousness. It's just all of a sudden you're nervous and you got a chipmunk in front of you, even though there isn't. And you cannot control that. It's wiring. There's nothing going from your prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. So when we do the brain lab in psychophysiology, one of the things you see is there is no nerve going from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. It doesn't exist. It's only going from the amygdala to the neocortex. So you have no control. It's wiring. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
So if you expect to see a ghost, you're more likely to change your perceptions to show a ghost, even though what you actually perceived is totally different. You fill in the gaps and make an image far more concrete and real than information coming from your senses warrant. So again, the event you consciously experience is not the one you perceive. Now we're going to get to things that are really a little odd that we discovered when we were working with epileptics, when you start cutting the commissures between the parts of the brain. Normally functioning brains continuously receive information from sensory storage areas to compare it with incoming signals and for other reasons. It's the other reasons that are only recently becoming understood. The conscious part of your brain has no way to tell if sensory information reaching it is coming from a memory area or is new material which was run through memory areas. Many memory areas are apparently stored so realistically that the conscious mind is totally fooled into thinking that a current event is happening. The experience of meeting relatives and others that are dead or simply not there happens when memory areas, including the hippocampus, are stimulated under such circumstances as during neurosurgical procedures. These feel incredibly real. In other words, a neurosurgeon stimulating a teeny little brain area brings a memory to a person, and the person swears up and down right then, since they're awake during most neurosurgical procedures, that Uncle so-and-so is in the room with them and talking to them. They cannot tell that this is a memory. It doesn't feel like it's a memory in any way. Now, what makes this more interesting is that when you bring a memory out of your memory into conscious, you can influence your memory. You can have a whole discussion with your memory. Then when you restore it, that discussion that you had with your memory is stored there. So you bring it out again later, and there's your whole discussion, which you think was real, even though it's not. These incredibly realistic memories can be elicited by stimulating the normal brain by using powerful magnets. And we now do this all the time. Just like we can use magnets to reliably produce out-of-body experiences. So children with temporal lobe epilepsy can have the same experiences when random bursts of electricity pass through the lobe. They think they're having all kinds of conversations with folks that aren't there, but it's their memories. So a totally normal person, apparently seeing and hearing, and sometimes talking with, a long dead relative and etc., it just plain happens. It's because of the way the brain processes information. And as I said, the memories change. So they're nothing like the original conversation. This is a big deal, and we didn't even know that this existed until a little more than 2 decades ago, when neurosurgeons started stimulating little teeny areas of the brain of awake people during neurosurgical procedures. And this is really, really spooky. My wife was one of the psychologists who worked on this, and it's incredibly spooky. Lastly, things really do go bump in the night. You know, we have no idea. We don't understand it. People have epiphanies all the time where there's obviously non-human communications, just as their dog died or something, or there's an absolutely inexplicable noise around you that you really have no idea why. One of the things that happened to us is we live out in the middle of nowhere, and there were 4 folks snoring in the bedroom, but there were only 3 of us in the room, our dog and my wife and I. And as I was waking up, I realized it was an extra snoring. And you know, what the heck is that? But it turned out to be my wife's buddy, the cougar, sleeping outside the window, snoring. So the thing is, there's uncountable other situations that we have no explanation for, or we can make up an explanation that we really can't verify. So I'm ending with the idea that there's far more unexplained than explained for this topic. Discussion, additions?
Yes, Rich, I wanted to add both from the standpoint of hardcore science as well as from the standpoint of some of the experimental work that may border into parapsychology. From the standpoint of animals and their abilities to communicate beyond the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Yes, sharks are able to use their special senses for detecting electromagnetic pulses, which are which enable them to see us or even detect a heartbeat. But what I have done in my studies was look at the effects of the PCBs in regressing the development of the central nervous system of harbor porpoises, for example, in which I was able to demonstrate that they may not be able to see the nets that may be set in the sea because of their exposure in their prenatal exposure to the PCBs, which retard the development of their central nervous system, including part of the auditory nervous system, whereby they're not able to perceive the nets as they should, and they therefore crash into them. But I've extended that study in a review to other animals, such as rattlesnakes or vipers which use infrared rays for communication. So that's the more hardcore part of it. But the other part, I've noticed that you did not include the interaction of consciousness or the soul with the brain as a model to explain some of what you were talking about. So I would like to have your comments on that.
Well, because we don't know how psychophysiology hooks in, I didn't include it. However, please remember we have an entire course in this now on essentially these phenomena. It's called anomalous phenomena, and we give it every other summer. And I invite all of you to take it, because that's where we talk about things like how the soul and the brain interact. That's a huge area, but it's not easily hooked to psychophysiology, and that's what I was talking about now. But if you want to explore that, and Horace, you'll be welcome to give a guest talk in that. Every student presents at least twice. So if you want to take that course and present, you are in. I didn't talk about the lateral. Excuse me?
I certainly will.
I didn't talk about the lateral line in most elasmobranchs and in Pisces, in fish and sharks type creatures, because our whole lateral line system appears to be about 12 cells in the brain. They haven't really been investigated. Our lungs are the old gills. And when that changed over, our lateral lines got incorporated into our lungs. And boy, we just don't have much of that left that anybody can, has really been able to find. So I didn't talk about that here because that's a fairly new area. For those of you who don't know Horace, Horace is a doctor of veterinary medicine as well as a PhD. And he specializes in aquatic vets. I also didn't talk about the pit sensors in many snakes and other animals. I didn't talk about the senses that various types of arachnids have. I kept this basically to humans. But we could expand this tremendously. Okay. Oh, hi, Cynthia. I didn't realize you were here.
I'm so sorry. I got locked into something outside of home and didn't get back until a half hour ago. So I apologize for not being present during this whole thing. But I do have a comment, if I may.
Bingo. Go.
So there's some things about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the way that it connects to the limbic systems that in fact innervate in a way that really make some of these experiences extremely real for people. And there's really interesting literature on that. And anyway, I just want to say that when someone is experiencing something like this, there's a reason why it feels so real to them, and that is because of the way in which the connections and the networks are functioning when these events are happening in the brain. I mean, they're very real to people that are experiencing them.
Thank you. I went over that a tiny, tiny little bit, but you were far more articulate.
Oh,
Not only
okay.
that, people are more likely to believe you since you've got the background.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a training in that. Yes, but anyway, it's just, I love hearing Rich talk about this because it's so interesting how there's a whole model of prediction in the brain where the brain predicts a certain event to happen. And if it happens, the brain's really happy. It's like, oh, what I predicted happens. If it doesn't happen, then the brain goes into freak out mode, like, oh, I don't know how to manage this. And so if the brain is predicting for some sort of a supernatural event or some kind of a event that might be more than natural, however you want to describe it, it's going to feel very comfortable with that experience, even though it's really not something that's happening, but the brain is going to believe it and trust it more because of this Bayesian model of prediction. So there's so much brain science tied into what Rich is talking about. It's just so phenomenal. It really is. Anyway, I just really apologize for being late. I got stuck in something and then there was an accident and traffic and nonsense, and I'm really sorry to be late.
What you really missed was Eric double scheduling himself with another class using the same Zoom address.
Oh,
so
no.
There were two classes here. So we got started late with, these poor people going, ghosts? We're talking about ghosts? It's supposed to be a practice session for our dissertation defenses. So, well.
Yeah, you can almost relate to that as being ghost-like.
Very much so.
Anyway, I just really wanted to throw that whole piece in there that about how much, because of what we do know a lot more, than we have around phenomenological experience and how the brain perceives it than we have over many years. So I just
Absolutely.
wanted to add that.
Thank
I'll
you.
shut up. That's it.
Don't shut up. Just show up in our anomalous phenomena course and talk about it.
I'm happy to do a talk around that. I think it would be a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But you've got Jerry. Jerry could probably do it better than me.
Jerry gives other talks for that.
I'm happy to do, I would love to be a guest star
Okay.
in the course.
Not this summer,
Rich,
next summer. And
Rich, also, there's also the aspect of shamans, for example, who
Yeah.
are able to easily move from one state, altered state of consciousness to another. And in that way, they can perceive beyond that narrow band of the visible or audible part of the
Yes.
electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah.
that's an area that we don't really understand because the recordings haven't been done to even let us get a good start. Many of you probably have a background in psychology. Do you remember when they did the first physiological recordings of people with split personalities? And it turned out that your psychophysiological profile is completely different for the different personalities,
Absolutely.
including what you can perceive. So there's a whole other area that we don't get into in talks like this.
Absolutely. There's a great chapter in the Alpha Theta book that I edited. One of our chapter authors wrote about using a multiple personality disorder, doing Alpha Theta training with her. She had 16 different disorders, and every time, not disorders, but personalities, and every single one had a different, not only physiological as in heart rate and all that kind of stuff, but brain profile. It's a really interesting chapter.
Yeah, this is the difference between philosophers talking about multiple personalities and psychophysiologists actually pinning it down is very, very different.
Yeah,
this is why we have this department.
Really
so Cynthia and Horace are both invited to give talks at our anomalous phenomena class.
I would love
and as you people have questions, please just send emails to any of us and we can talk about it more. So that it's 6:30, that's about all we have time for unless there's a few questions. Everybody's now afraid to say anything, right?
For fear of what might go on in their brain.
I asked a question if we have the cells to detect subconsciously electromagnetic fields, like how does it, or magnetic fields, like how does it affect human behavior?
That's a really big question.
Well, it does very directly because the way you orient in space is because of magnetic lines around you. We do an experiment in the anomalous phenomena class and in other classes where you are blindfolded, you're put in a chair that's rotated around, and you're asked which way you're facing. And people, about 3/4 of people, with men doing better than women, can reliably say, I'm pointing in X direction. Not north, but some particular direction. So it influences our ability to find our way around very, very much. And that's one behavior that we've tied down. There seem to be others, but a lot of it hasn't been tied down yet. We're very glad that this isn't a matter of philosophy anymore, but that we actually found the cells. Now we can go from there and do the experiments.
Yeah.
Same
that's
for,
right.
if we can get Horace interested in humans, research, we can, start investigating the human lateral line cells. All 12 of the things that are left and, outside your lungs.
I
What are
wouldn't,
these sensory organs in our lungs doing? How come you can taste in your lungs and, and see colors in your lungs? What's that got to do with the lateral line? We don't know, because, the people that are experts in fish don't investigate humans.
I'll look into it.
It's just a big unknown. Natasha, if you want to look into this, we got lots of doctoral areas that are open to you that you can
Great.
do research on.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Okay, thank you for attending. Again, questions and whatnot, feel free to ask.
All right, thank you, Rich.
Okay.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see you guys.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.